You were written off like an old name scratched out of a script they swore you'd never act in again. They didn't just expect your fall. They counted on it, structured their comfort around it, laughed quietly, reassured themselves with stories about how you couldn't handle it. And for a while, it looked like they were right. You did disappear. You stopped posting. You stopped explaining. You went ghost. But they mistook the disappearance for defeat. They didn't realize you were cocooning, not collapsing, that you weren't gone, you were transforming. And now that you've returned, sharper, quieter, clearer than ever, they panic. Because their narrative doesn't fit you anymore. They built a story around your failure, and now they're choking on their own script. What they didn't expect was for the silence to change you. They assumed it would eat you alive. That solitude would unravel you. That time alone meant time wasted. But it didn't unravel you. It refined you. You sat in your own mind and turned the volume up. You stared at your pain without blinking. You met every doubt like it owed you answers. And somewhere in that stillness, you stopped needing permission to continue. You realized no one was coming to save you, and instead of crumbling, you started building. One decision at a time, one rule at a time, you rewrote what power meant, not control, not revenge, clarity. The kind that walks into a room without needing to be validated. That's what you brought back with you. A level of internal gravity that bends the air around you. And when they see it, their first thought is confusion. Their second is fear. They wanted to be spectators at your funeral, not witnesses to your rebirth. It's easier for them to understand pain than it is to understand resilience. They can digest your tears, but your composure unsettles them. Because it reminds them that you didn't need their apology to evolve. You didn't need closure to start walking again. You left behind the echo chamber they thought you couldn't live without. And in doing so, you became dangerous. Not because you're vengeful, but because you've outgrown their access. Your peace is now your power. And peace, once earned, becomes lethal to those who thrived on your chaos. They try the old tricks, guilt, doubt, noise, but none of it works anymore. Because the version of you that once reacted, that version was laid to rest. And the one who came back in its place, that one doesn't flinch. You don't talk the way you used to. Not because you're hiding something, but because you've outlived the need to explain. They can feel it in the pauses, in the way you choose when and where to speak. Your voice doesn't chase understanding anymore. It moves like it already knows. They're not just startled by your return. They're disoriented, because people expect survivors to come back limping, begging, fragmented. But you came back with precision, with fewer words and a sharper gaze. And what terrifies them isn't your presence, it's your detachment. The fact that you returned without reaching, without needing them to acknowledge what they did. That kind of self-possession. It doesn't just silence a room, it rewires it. They hoped you'd stay angry, because anger is predictable. Anger still connects you to them. It keeps the energy alive. But your indifference, that's where their illusion dies. You're not trying to prove anything. You're not performing healing. You're living it. And that living looks like calm boundaries. Like not returning the call. Like smiling in silence when they try to provoke you. They thought they broke you. What they really did was activate the part of you that was done playing the polite version of survival. Now you move like a closed circuit, self-charged, self-sustained. And the ones who watched your collapse now realize the most dangerous version of you was the one who healed without asking for permission. Coming back wasn't the revenge. The revenge was what you became. You built a life that didn't include them, and that's the part they can't swallow. You weren't supposed to glow like this. You weren't supposed to find better. You weren't supposed to move on so completely that their name doesn't even taste like bitterness anymore. You let go for real. That's what stings. They hoped you'd fake your healing just long enough for them to slide back in. But the door never reopened. Because you didn't change the locks. You tore down the building. And now they're standing in an empty field wondering where their power went. You didn't take it back. You replaced it with your own. You outgrew the frame they tried to keep you in. And now they can't stand how well you fit in the freedom they never thought you'd earn. You laugh differently. You walk differently. You choose differently, because you're no longer trying to outrun your past. You're building from it. Every failure, every betrayal, every breakdown, you turn them into bricks. That's what you came back with. A foundation made of former versions of yourself. The ones who broke, but didn't stay broken. The ones who cried, but kept learning. The ones who were rejected, but didn't forget who they were. You returned, not as a repeat, but as a rewrite. And what do you do with people who only knew how to read the old chapters? You leave them behind with the rest of the fiction. There's a level of healing that turns you into a mirror. And now, every time they see you, they flinch. Not because you hurt them, but because you reflect the part of themselves they never dealt with. You didn't come back to haunt them. You came back to live. But your presence is the consequence. The way you now smile without apology. The way you breathe without shrinking. The way you exist without explaining. They don't know how to face someone they never thought would get up again. And you don't even need to remind them. The weight of your resilience is doing the talking. The kind of weight that doesn't demand revenge. It just refuses to kneel ever again. You reclaimed every piece of yourself they tried to discard. It was never about revenge. You didn't come back to prove a point or to make them feel small. You came back because something inside you refused to stay fragmented. They tossed away parts of you casually, like excess weight they didn't need to carry. Your patience, your softness, your ambition, your curiosity. They told you those traits were liabilities, told you to quiet them, shrink them, trade them for approval. And for a while, you believed them. You learned how to compartmentalize your soul just to survive the room. But survival was never the destination. It was the tunnel. And when you finally emerged, you didn't come out swinging. You came out whole. That wholeness confused them more than any retaliation ever could, because they expected bitterness. They expected you to mirror their cruelty. Instead, you mirrored yourself back into existence. At some point, you stopped asking which version of you was acceptable. That question had kept you trapped for years. You learned to perform different selves depending on the audience, editing your instincts in real time. They benefited from that fragmentation. It made you manageable, predictable, easy to guilt. But the reclamation began the moment you realized you were exhausted from pretending to be incomplete. You started gathering yourself quietly, calling back the instincts you'd buried, trusting the anger you were taught to suppress, honoring the ambition they told you was too much. They noticed the shift before you ever spoke about it. Because the moment you stop seeking permission, the entire dynamic changes. They couldn't bargain with you anymore. They couldn't shame you back into place. You weren't angry, you were aligned. And alignment is something manipulators can't negotiate with. You didn't reclaim yourself all at once. It happened in fragments, in small refusals that felt terrifying at first. You said no and didn't explain. You chose rest over proving your worth. You listened to your discomfort instead of silencing it for harmony. Each act looked insignificant from the outside, but inside, it was a coup. You were taking back territory that had been occupied for years. They thought you were becoming distant. What you were actually becoming was intact. You were stitching yourself back together with discernment instead of desperation. And the more whole you became, the less interested you were in punishment. Revenge requires obsession. You no longer had the energy for that. Your focus shifted inward, toward building a life that didn't require their absence to feel like justice. They kept waiting for you to lash out, to expose them, to collapse or confront. That's how they understood conflict. But your growth refused to follow their script. You didn't want their downfall. You wanted your clarity. You didn't want them to hurt. You wanted to stop hurting yourself. That distinction changed everything. It meant you no longer needed them to acknowledge the damage. You acknowledged it yourself. You stopped negotiating with people who minimized your experience. You stopped revisiting rooms that required you to leave pieces of yourself at the door. And in doing so, you took back your time, your attention, your emotional bandwidth. That's not revenge. That's sovereignty. And sovereignty is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It just stops asking. You began to understand something unsettling and freeing at the same time. They didn't steal pieces of you. You gave them away trying to be loved. That realization didn't shame you. It matured you. It taught you where your boundaries had been porous and why. You forgave yourself for the survival strategies that once kept you afloat. And with that self-forgiveness came power. You no longer needed to demonize them to justify your distance. You could see them clearly without needing to destroy them in your mind. That clarity stripped the situation of drama. It turned pain into information. Information into wisdom. Wisdom into restraint. And restraint is what scared them most, because it meant you had finally outgrown emotional bargaining. When you reclaimed yourself, you noticed how different your reactions became. Old triggers lost their grip. Old narratives lost their urgency. They tried to bait you with familiar tactics, but you felt nothing but recognition. Recognition without attachment. You saw the move for what it was and chose not to play. That choice wasn't passive. It was decisive. It was the product of someone who had rebuilt their internal authority. You no longer needed to win arguments to feel secure. You no longer needed to be understood to feel valid. That internal stability made external chaos irrelevant. And irrelevance is far more devastating to control than confrontation. They didn't lose because you attacked. They lost because you stopped participating. You also reclaimed your future. That part matters. You stopped living as a reaction to what they did. You stopped shaping your goals around avoiding past pain. You began choosing based on desire, not defense. That shift took courage. It required trusting yourself again after years of self-doubt. But trust grows when you keep promises to yourself. You kept them. You showed up. You followed through. You walked away when something felt wrong, even when it felt lonely. That consistency rebuilt your self-respect. And self-respect dissolves the need for revenge, because revenge is rooted in powerlessness. You were no longer powerless. You were directional. They might still tell stories about you. People often do when they lose access. But those stories don't reach you anymore. Not because you're hardened, but because you're busy living in alignment. You don't monitor their opinions. You don't correct the record. You don't defend your evolution. You understand now that your life doesn't need consensus. It needs coherence. And coherence comes from living in a way that matches your values, not from convincing others you're right. That realization freed enormous energy. Energy you redirected into building, learning, deepening. The absence of revenge created space for mastery. Reclaiming yourself also meant accepting that some bridges were burned without fire. You didn't torch them. You simply stopped walking across them. That quiet ending was intentional. You didn't need drama to justify departure. You trusted your inner verdict. You allowed yourself to leave without applause. That's a mark of maturity they didn't anticipate. Because mature exits don't feed the ego of those left behind. They starve it. They don't get closure packaged for them. They get distance. And distance forces reflection. Whether they use it or not is no longer your concern.